The flames danced higher against the twilight sky as Daisy Turner clutched her trembling hands to her chest, watching helplessly as the last remaining walls of her home collapsed into the ravenous fire. Everything she and Thomas had built over 12 years of marriage gone in a matter of hours. The drought that had plagued Wyatt, Colorado for months had turned the wooden structure into perfect kindling, and a single spark from her cooking stove had been all it took to destroy her world. The year was 1878, and being a widow alone in the West was difficult enough without losing everything else you owned. 3 months had passed since Thomas's horse had returned without him, and the search party had found his body at the bottom of a ravine. Now, standing before the smoldering ruins on this April evening, Daisy felt utterly alone. "Madam, you all right?" The deep voice startled her from behind. Daisy turned to find a tall man with a weathered face and kind eyes watching her from beneath the brim of a dusty hat. She recognized him vaguely. He'd ridden with the men who'd recovered Thomas's body but couldn't recall his name. "Does this look like I'm all right?" she replied, her voice breaking despite her attempt at strength. She was 26 years old and had just lost everything. The cowboy dismounted his horse and stepped closer, removing his hat. "Name's Griffin Cole, madam. I run cattle about 10 miles east." He surveyed the smoking remains with a grim expression. "I was heading into town when I saw the smoke." "You're too late," Daisy said flatly, "as you can see." Griffin nodded solemnly. "What will you do now, Mrs. Turner?" Daisy brushed a strand of auburn hair from her face, leaving a streak of soot across her cheek. "I don't know. I have some money saved. Perhaps I'll go east to my sister in St. Louis." The thought filled her with dread, admitting defeat. Returning to the city, she'd fled years ago when she'd fallen in love with Thomas and his dreams of a life in the West. Griffin studied the ruins for a long moment, then looked at her with a determined expression. "Don't reckon you have to leave." "Land's still good." "And what would I do with good land and no home?" she asked bitterly. Griffin replaced his hat, squaring his shoulders. "Then you'll build a new one with me." Daisy stared at him. "I beg your pardon. I mean it, Mrs. Turner. This town takes care of its own. We can raise a cabin for you before winter. I'd be pleased to help organize it." "Mr. Cole, I appreciate the sentiment, but Griffin," he corrected, "and it's no sentiment, it's what neighbors do." He gestured to the open land around them. "Thomas Turner was a good man. Helped me with my first cattle drive when I was greener than spring grass. I owe him." Daisy felt the first tears start to fall. She'd held them back throughout the fire, working frantically to save what she could, which amounted to little more than a trunk of clothes, her mother's china shepherdess, and Thomas's pocket watch. Now, faced with unexpected kindness, her composure cracked. "You don't owe me anything," she managed. Griffin's expression softened. "Maybe not, but I'm offering all the same." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them both turn. Sheriff Wade Miller and 3 other townspeople arrived, faces grim as they took in the devastation. "Daisy, I'm so sorry," Sheriff Miller said, dismounting. "Is there anything salvageable?" She gestured weakly to the few possessions she'd managed to save, piled beneath the old cottonwood tree that stood a safe distance from the house. The sheriff nodded grimly. "You'll stay with Martha and me tonight. No arguments." "I was just telling Mrs. Turner," Griffin interjected, "that we ought to organize a house raising, get her back on her feet." The sheriff looked between them. "That's mighty generous, Cole. You thinking of coordinating it?" Griffin nodded. "If Mrs. Turner is amenable." All eyes turned to Daisy. She felt overwhelmed, exhausted, and utterly lost. The thought of accepting charity made her uncomfortable, but she had nowhere else to go, and St. Louis seemed impossibly far away. I don't know how to thank you all," she said finally. Griffin shook his head. "No need for thanks. We'll start planning tomorrow. For now, you should get some rest." As the sheriff led her away to his wagon, Daisy glanced back at Griffin Cole. He stood straight-backed against the darkening sky, watching her go. Something about his quiet strength made her think that perhaps, just perhaps, all was not lost. The following morning, Daisy awoke in the Miller's spare bedroom, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Reality crashed over her as she remembered the fire, the loss, the devastation. She dressed quickly in one of the few dresses she'd saved and made her way downstairs where Martha Miller was cooking breakfast. There you are, dear, Martha said warmly. Sit down and have some hot cakes. You need your strength. Thank you for your hospitality, Daisy said, sinking into a chair. I'll try not to impose for long. Martha waved a dismissive hand. Nonsense, you'll stay as long as needed. She placed a steaming plate in front of Daisy. Griffin Cole was by earlier. Daisy looked up sharply. He was, he's already talking to folks about materials for your new home. That man works fast when he sets his mind to something. Daisy felt a flutter of something gratitude, certainly, but also a strange uneasiness. I hardly know him. Martha smiled knowingly. Griffin keeps to himself mostly. Came here about 5 years ago, started with just a handful of cattle. Now he runs one of the most prosperous spreads in the county. Honest as the day is long. I can't accept such generosity without giving something in return, Daisy insisted. You'll find a way to repay the kindness, I'm sure. This is how we survive out here, by helping each other. After breakfast, Daisy insisted on accompanying Martha to the general store where, to her surprise, Griffin was already engaged in conversation with the owner, Harold Jenkins. Mrs. Turner, Griffin acknowledged her with a tip of his hat. I was just discussing lumber with Mr. Jenkins. He's agreed to provide what we need at cost. That's very generous, Daisy said, looking between the men. It's nothing, Jenkins assured her. Thomas was a good customer and a better friend. Griffin unfolded a rough sketch on the counter. I've drawn up plans for a simple cabin to start. Something sturdy to get you through winter. Come spring, we can think about expanding it if you wish. Daisy stepped closer to examine the drawing. It showed a one-room cabin with a stone fireplace, much smaller than the home she'd shared with Thomas, but practical and solid. You did this? She asked, surprised by the detailed plans. Griffin nodded. Worked as a carpenter's apprentice back east before heading west. It's a sound design. We can modify it if you have preferences. No, it's perfect, thank you. She meant it. The simple act of seeing plans for a new home made the future seem less bleak. I've got men lined up to start clearing the burned remains tomorrow, Griffin continued. Should have the foundation laid by week's end if the weather holds. So quickly, Daisy was astonished. No sense wasting time. Winter comes early in these parts. Martha touched Daisy's arm gently. While the men work on the house, you'll stay with us. Wade and I have plenty of room. I can't thank you all enough, Daisy said. Feeling overwhelmed by the community's response, Griffin rolled up the plans. Thanks aren't necessary, Mrs. Turner. Just be ready to work. Building a home isn't easy, even with help. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Cole, she responded with a lift of her chin. And please call me Daisy. A slight smile touched his lips. Daisy then, and I'm Griffin to my friends. Are we friends then? She asked, somewhat boldly. His eyes held hers for a moment. I reckon we're getting there. The next day dawned clear and cool. Daisy arrived at her property shortly after sunrise to find Griffin already there with 4 other men, clearing the charred remains of her former home. She stood watching for a moment, struck by the efficiency with which they worked, before approaching. Good morning, she called. Griffin straightened, wiping sweat from his brow despite the morning chill. Daisy, didn't expect to see you so early. I couldn't sit idle while others worked on my behalf, she replied. I've brought coffee and biscuits. She held up the basket Martha had helped her prepare. The men gratefully paused for refreshments, and Daisy took the opportunity to survey what remained of her former life. Most of the debris had already been cleared away, leaving a blackened footprint where the house had stood. She was surprised by how small it looked now, the place that had held so many memories reduced to a sooty rectangle on the earth. We'll build it here, Griffin said, coming to stand beside her. Unless you'd prefer another spot on your land, Daisy considered the question. No. This is where it should be. Despite the pain of the loss, this spot had been home. It would be again, Griffin nodded. I thought you might feel that way. The foundation stones weren't damaged in the fire. We can reuse them, save some time and materials. As the day progressed, more townspeople arrived to help. By midday, 20 men and women were working together, clearing debris, salvaging usable materials, and beginning to lay out the dimensions of the new cabin. Daisy worked alongside them, refusing to be treated as helpless despite their protests. You don't have to prove anything, Griffin told her as she struggled with a heavy timber. I'm not trying to prove anything, she responded, breathing heavily. This is my home. I want to help build it. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough, but there are better ways you can help without throwing your back out. He guided her toward where two women were mixing mud mortar for the stone foundation. Martha could use another pair of hands. Daisy reluctantly joined the other women, though she had to admit the work was no less important. As they labored, Martha kept up a steady stream of conversation. Griffin's organized everything beautifully, she remarked. Not surprising, though, that man has a head for details. You seem to think highly of him, Daisy observed. Martha nodded. He's a good man, keeps to himself mostly, but he's always the first to offer help when it's needed. She lowered her voice. Lost his wife and child to fever back east, from what I hear. Never speaks of it, though. The information gave Daisy pause. She watched Griffin directing the men, his tall figure moving purposefully among them. There was something in his bearing that spoke of strength, but also of an inner solitude she recognized all too well. By sunset, the foundation was laid and the first-floor joists were in place. As the workers began to disperse, promising to return the next day, Daisy approached Griffin, who was studying the day's progress with a critical eye. Thank you, she said simply. I never expected such generosity. He glanced at her, then back at the beginnings of the cabin. It's coming along well. Weather holds, we might have walls up by end of week. May I ask you something personal? She ventured. His expression turned guarded. You can ask. Why are you doing this, really? Griffin was silent for a long moment. Like I said, Thomas helped me once. There's more to it than that, he sighed, removing his hat to run a hand through his hair. Maybe I know something about losing everything. Maybe I know it's the helping hands afterward that make the difference between giving up and going on. Daisy nodded, understanding more than he realized. Well, thank you all the same. Will you join us for supper at the Millers? Martha's insisting. Griffin hesitated, then shook his head. Need to get back to my ranch. Got hands watching the cattle, but there's other work needs doing. Another time then, Daisy said, trying to hide her disappointment. Another time, he agreed, replacing his hat and mounting his horse. He looked down at her, his expression softening slightly. You did good work today, Daisy. Thomas would be proud. The mention of her late husband's name brought a bittersweet pang. I hope so. Griffin nodded once more and rode off, leaving Daisy to contemplate the skeleton of her new home as twilight descended. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Each day, townsfolk arrived to help with the building, bringing food, materials, and willing hands. The cabin walls rose steadily, log by log. Daisy worked alongside everyone, learning new skills daily: how to chink between logs with a mixture of mud, straw, and lime, how to help raise the heavy roof beams, how to shingle a roof. Griffin was present every day, arriving before dawn and often working until dusk. He rarely spoke except to give directions or answer questions, but his quiet competence inspired confidence in everyone. Daisy found herself watching him when she thought he wouldn't notice, intrigued by this man who had so suddenly become central to rebuilding her life. One evening, as the workers were departing, and the cabin was nearly complete, lacking only finishing touches to the interior, Daisy found Griffin alone, examining the stone fireplace they'd constructed. Will it draw properly? She asked, coming to stand beside him. He nodded. It's built right. Should keep you warm through winter. He ran a hand along the mantelpiece. Still needs a bit of smoothing, but that can wait till tomorrow. I can do that, Daisy offered. You've all done so much already. Griffin turned to look at her fully, and Daisy was struck by the intensity in his hazel eyes. You've worked harder than anyone. Don't sell yourself short. She smiled wryly. Hardly. I've mostly just tried to stay out of the way and be useful. That's not how I see it. He gestured around them. This cabin's as much your work as anyone's, maybe more. The praise warmed her unexpectedly. Thank you. After a moment's hesitation, she added, would you like to stay for supper? It's just me tonight. Martha's visiting her sister in Denver, but I've made a stew and there's plenty. Griffin looked surprised by the invitation. He glanced toward his horse, then back at her. I don't want to impose. You wouldn't be. In fact, I'd welcome the company. The admission surprised her as much as him, and it would give me a chance to thank you properly for everything you've done. After a long moment, he nodded. All right, thank you. They walked together to the miller's house, an awkward silence between them that Daisy felt compelled to fill. "Martha told me you came from the East originally," Griffin nodded. "Pennsylvania, long time ago now. What brought you west?" His stride faltered almost imperceptibly. Change of scenery. Understanding he didn't wish to elaborate, Daisy changed the subject. "How many cattle do you run on your ranch?" The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. "About 300 head now. Started with just 30. Been building the herd slow but steady." "That's impressive." "Just takes patience and hard work," Griffin replied. "Same as anything worth having." At the miller's house, Daisy busied herself preparing their simple meal while Griffin awkwardly seated himself at the kitchen table. It struck her that despite his commanding presence at the building site, he seemed uncomfortable in a domestic setting. "Do you cook for yourself at your ranch?" she asked, ladling stew into bowls. "Simple things. Nothing fancy." "No ranch hand to cook for you." "Got 2 hands that help with the cattle, but they've got their own cabin. I keep to myself mostly." Daisy placed a bowl before him. "That sounds lonely." Griffin looked up, meeting her eyes. "Simpler that way." They ate in silence for a few minutes before Daisy ventured another question. "How long have you been in Wyatt?" 5 years come November." "And before that," Griffin set down his spoon, studying her with an unreadable expression. "You ask a lot of questions, Mrs. Turner." "Daisy," she corrected. "And yes, I do. It's how people get to know one another." "Is that what we're doing? Getting to know one another?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. I suppose so. Is that a problem?" Griffin sighed, running a hand over his face. "No, it's not a problem. I'm just not used to it, is all." He picked up his spoon again. "Before Wyatt, I was in Kansas, and before that, various places. Moved around a lot after leaving Pennsylvania." "What made you stay here?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "The land. First time I rode up on that ridge above my property, looked out over the valley, felt like home." "Never had that feeling before." Daisy nodded, understanding completely. "That's how I felt when Thomas brought me here. I'd never been west of the Mississippi before meeting him, but the moment I saw these mountains, I knew I belonged here." "And now, after everything?" Griffin asked quietly. Daisy considered the question. "Now more than ever. This is my home. The fire didn't change that." Griffin studied her with something like admiration. "You're a strong woman, Daisy Turner." "I don't feel strong most days," she admitted, "but I'm still standing." "That's what strength is," he said simply. After supper, Griffin insisted on helping with the dishes, a gesture that surprised and touched Daisy. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, and she found herself acutely aware of his presence, the solid breadth of his shoulders, the careful precision of his movements, the faint scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to him. "Thank you for staying," she said as they finished. "It was nice to have company." Griffin nodded, drying his hands on a towel. "Thank you for the meal, best I've had in some time." "You're welcome at my table anytime," Daisy said, surprising herself with the sincerity of the offer. He looked at her for a long moment. "I should get back." "Early start tomorrow." "Of course." She walked him to the door, suddenly reluctant to see him go. "Griffin," he paused at the threshold, turning back, "I'll never be able to repay you for what you've done." "Not asking to be repaid," he said quietly, "I know." "That's what makes it all the more meaningful." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Griffin cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "Good night, Daisy." "Good night, Griffin." She watched him mount his horse and ride away into the gathering darkness, wondering at the strange, fluttering sensation in her chest. The cabin was completed by the end of May, just as spring was giving way to summer. It was simple but sturdy, with one large room serving as kitchen, dining, and living area, and a small sleeping alcove partitioned off for privacy. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, and 2 windows let in ample light. It was smaller than her previous home, but as Daisy stood in the center of the finished structure, surrounded by townspeople who had come to celebrate its completion, she felt a sense of pride and belonging that outweighed any sense of loss. "Speech," someone called, and others took up the cry. Daisy blushed but stepped forward. "I don't have the words to express my gratitude to all of you. When I lost everything, you gave me hope and a home. I will never forget your kindness. Thank you from the bottom of my heart." Cheers went up and someone started playing a fiddle. Soon the celebration was in full swing, with dancing, food, and drink. Daisy moved among her neighbors, thanking each person individually, but her eyes kept searching for one particular figure. Griffin stood apart from the festivities, leaning against the doorframe, observing rather than participating. When their eyes met across the room, he gave her a slight nod that somehow conveyed more than words could have. She made her way to him, weaving through the celebrating townspeople. "Not one for parties?" she asked when she reached him. "Not especially," he admitted. "But I wanted to see you settled before I headed back to my ranch." "Headed back?" Something in his tone alarmed her. "You sound like you're leaving for good." Griffin shifted uncomfortably. "Got business in Denver, might be gone a while." "I see." Daisy tried to hide her disappointment. "When do you leave?" "First light tomorrow." An awkward silence fell between them. Daisy felt a strange urge to ask him to stay, but she had no right to make such a request. Instead, she said, "The cabin is perfect. I can't thank you enough. It's solid. Should serve you well." He glanced around at the gathered townspeople. "You won't be alone. They're good people." "Yes, they are." Daisy hesitated, then added, "But I'll miss your company." Griffin's eyes, usually so guarded, revealed a flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or emotion quickly controlled. "I'm not much for company." Nevertheless, she smiled up at him, feeling bold. "I've grown used to seeing you every day. It will be strange when you're gone." Before he could respond, Martha Miller appeared at Daisy's elbow. "There you are. Come, dear, everyone wants to toast to your new home." With an apologetic glance at Griffin, Daisy allowed herself to be led away. When she looked back a few minutes later, he was gone. The next morning, Daisy rose before dawn and hurried to her new cabin. She'd spent her final night at the Millers, but today she would officially move into her new home. As she approached in the gray light of early morning, she was surprised to see Griffin's horse tethered outside. She found him on the porch, setting down a crate. "Griffin, what are you doing here so early?" He straightened, looking almost embarrassed. "Brought you a housewarming gift." He gestured to the crate. "Seeds for a garden, vegetables mostly, some flowers too. It's late in the season to plant, but they should take if you get them in the ground soon." Daisy was touched by the thoughtful gift. "Thank you, that's very kind." Griffin shuffled uncomfortably. "Also, there's this." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "It's not much." Daisy unwrapped it carefully to reveal a small, intricately carved wooden box. The lid featured a delicate pattern of wildflowers that she recognized as columbines, Colorado's state flower. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Made it myself," Griffin admitted. "For your keepsakes. Noticed you had that china figurine and your husband's watch. Thought you might want someplace special to keep them." Tears pricked at Daisy's eyes. The simple gift represented hours of careful work, and the thought behind it moved her deeply. "I don't know what to say. Don't need to say anything." Griffin shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with her emotion. "Well, I should be on my way. Long ride ahead. How long will you be gone?" Daisy asked, clutching the box to her chest. "Not sure. Few weeks, maybe longer." An impulsive urge seized her. "I'll write to you, if you'd like, that is." Griffin looked genuinely surprised. "You want to write to me?" "Yes," Daisy said firmly, "to let you know how the garden grows and—" "Other news." He studied her for a long moment. "All right," he finally said. "Address is Griffin Cole, Box 12, Denver Post Office. I'll check when I can." "I'll write," she promised. Griffin nodded, then hesitated as if wanting to say more. Instead, he simply touched the brim of his hat. "Take care of yourself, Daisy Turner. And you, Griffin Cole." She watched him mount his horse and ride away, the wooden box still clutched to her chest, feeling as though something important had just begun, though she couldn't have said exactly what. The weeks following Griffin's departure were busy ones for Daisy. She planted the garden he'd given her, arranged her few possessions in the new cabin, and began to establish a routine in her rebuilt life. The wooden box sat on the mantelpiece, holding her most precious possessions, the china shepherdess, Thomas's pocket watch. And now the letters she wrote to Griffin, true to her word. Daisy wrote regularly, filling pages with details of her daily life, the progress of her garden, news of the town. She didn't know if the letters reached him, as no replies came, but the act of writing made her feel connected to him somehow. As June turned to July and the summer heat intensified, Daisy found herself thinking of Griffin often. She wondered what business kept him in Denver, whether he thought of Wyatt and of her, and when he might return. She told herself her interest was merely gratitude and friendship, but in quiet moments she acknowledged it might be something more. One sweltering afternoon, as Daisy was watering her thriving garden, Martha Miller appeared at the gate. "My goodness, look how everything's grown," Martha exclaimed, examining the neat rows of vegetables. "Those seeds Griffin gave you certainly took well." Daisy nodded, wiping sweat from her brow. "They did. I'll have more than I can eat by harvest time." "You can preserve the extra," Martha suggested. "Speaking of Griffin, any word from him?" Daisy shook her head. "Nothing, I've written, but—" Martha's expression turned sympathetic. "Men aren't much for correspondence, I'm afraid. Wade once went to Cheyenne for 3 months and sent exactly 1 telegram the entire time." "I'm sure he's busy," Daisy said, trying to sound unconcerned. "What brings you by today?" "I've come with an invitation," Martha replied. "The town's holding a Independence Day celebration on the 4th. There'll be a picnic, games for the children, and dancing in the evening. We'd love for you to come." Daisy hesitated. She hadn't attended any social functions since Thomas's death beyond church services and the cabin raising. The thought of joining in festivities felt strange. Martha seemed to read her thoughts. "It's been over 4 months, Daisy. No one would think it improper for you to enjoy yourself a little." "I suppose you're right," Daisy conceded. "Thank you for the invitation. I'll be there." The 4th of July dawned clear and hot. Daisy dressed carefully in her best dress, a blue cotton with white trim that Thomas had always admired, and arranged her hair in a simple but flattering style. As she pinned her hat in place, she caught sight of her reflection and was surprised to see color in her cheeks that had been absent for months. Perhaps Martha was right, it was time to rejoin the world. The celebration was held in the town square, which had been decorated with bunting and flags for the occasion. Tables laden with food lined one side, while games and contests occupied another area. Children darted about, shrieking with excitement, while adults gathered in conversational groups. Daisy was warmly welcomed by her neighbors, many expressing pleasure at seeing her join the festivities. She found herself genuinely enjoying the atmosphere, the sense of community, the simple pleasure of being among friends. When the dancing began as twilight fell, however, she retreated to the sidelines, content to watch others. "Not dancing, Mrs. Turner?" Sheriff Miller asked, approaching with a cup of punch. "I don't think so," Daisy replied, "but thank you. Shame. Young woman like you shouldn't be sitting out all the dances." He handed her the punch and sat beside her. "Any word from Cole?" The question surprised her. "No, have you heard something?" The sheriff shook his head. "Just wondering, he's been gone longer than I expected." "I'm sure he has his reasons," Daisy said, trying to sound unconcerned. Sheriff Miller studied her for a moment. "He will come back, you know. Man like Griffin Cole doesn't put down roots just to pull them up again without good cause." Before Daisy could respond, a commotion at the edge of the square drew their attention. A rider had arrived, his horse lathered with exertion. The crowd parted as he dismounted and strode toward the sheriff. "Miller," the man called, "got trouble at the Simmons place." Fires broken out in the south pasture, winds pushing it toward the homestead. The sheriff was on his feet immediately. "How bad?" "Bad enough. Simmons is trying to dig a fire break, but he needs help." "Round up volunteers," the sheriff ordered. "I'll get my horse." The celebration dissolved into purposeful activity as men hurried to gather tools and horses. Daisy, remembering all too vividly the horror of her own fire, stepped forward. "I'll come too," she told Martha. "I can help with the children if nothing else." Martha nodded grimly. "I'll bring bandages and medicines. Fire injuries are nasty business." Within half an hour, a convoy of wagons and riders was heading toward the Simmons Ranch, which lay about 5 miles south of town. As they approached, Daisy could see the orange glow of flames against the night sky and smell the acrid scent of burning grass. Her heart clenched with sympathy and remembered fear. The scene at the ranch was one of desperate activity. John Simmons and his teenage sons were frantically digging a firebreak between the advancing flames and their home. while Mrs. Simmons and the younger children were carrying buckets of water to wet down the roof and walls of the house. The volunteers from town immediately divided into groups, some joining the firebreak effort, others forming a bucket brigade, still others helping to move livestock to safety. Daisy joined Mrs. Simmons, helping to organize the smaller children and keep them safely away from the fire while still allowing the older ones to assist. For hours, they battled the flames under a sky now clouded with smoke. The fire, fueled by dry grass and a steady wind, seemed determined to reach the homestead. Just as it appeared they might lose the fight, a sound made Daisy look up. Riders were approaching from the north, a dozen men on horseback, led by a familiar tall figure. Griffin Cole and his ranch hands had arrived, bringing with them wet blankets and additional tools. With the fresh reinforcements, they managed to widen the firebreak enough to halt the fire's advance. By dawn, the danger had passed, though smoking patches remained where men kept vigilant watch for rekindling. Daisy, exhausted and smoke-stained, was helping Mrs. Simmons distribute coffee to the tired firefighters when she felt a presence behind her. Turning, she found Griffin standing there, his face blackened with soot, his eyes bloodshot from the smoke. "You're back," she said simply, her heart suddenly racing. "Got to Denver yesterday," he replied, his voice hoarse. "Was on my way to Wyatt when I saw the fire." He accepted the cup of coffee she offered. "Didn't expect to find you here in the thick of it." "I know something about losing a home to fire," Daisy said. "Couldn't stay away." Griffin's expression softened. "No, I don't suppose you could." They stood in silence for a moment, both aware of the curious glances being cast their way by others. Finally, Griffin spoke again. "Got your letters, all of them." Daisy felt a flush creep up her neck. "You didn't write back." "No, I didn't." He looked down at his coffee. "Not good with words on paper, but I read everyone, twice, most of them." The admission warmed her more than she would have expected. "I'm glad you're back safely," Griffin nodded. "Need to speak with you when things settle down here." "Of course." Daisy tried to interpret his serious expression. "Is something wrong?" "No," he almost smiled. "Nothing's wrong, just need to talk. I'll call on you tomorrow if that's acceptable." "Yes, that would be fine." Griffin drained his coffee cup and handed it back to her, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "Get some rest if you can. You look dead on your feet." With that, he returned to where the men were still watching for hotspots, leaving Daisy to wonder what important matter warranted a formal call. True to his word, Griffin appeared at Daisy's cabin the following afternoon. She had spent the morning cleaning both herself and her home, washing away the smoke and grime from the fire and changing into a fresh dress. When his knock came, she found herself unexpectedly nervous. Griffin stood on her porch, similarly cleaned up, wearing a fresh shirt and his best trousers. He held his hat in his hands, turning it awkwardly. "Come in," Daisy invited, stepping back. "Would you like some coffee or lemonade? It's rather hot today." "Lemonade would be welcome," Griffin said, following her inside. He looked around approvingly at what she'd done with the cabin. She'd added curtains at the windows, arranged her few possessions with care, and placed wildflowers in a jar on the table. The wooden box he'd given her held pride of place on the mantel. "You've made it home," he observed. Daisy nodded, pouring lemonade into 2 glasses. "It feels like home now, thanks to you and everyone who helped build it." They sat at the small table, an awkward silence falling between them. Finally, Griffin cleared his throat. "I want to explain why I was in Denver so long." "You don't owe me any explanations," Daisy said quickly. "Maybe not, but I want to give them all the same." Griffin took a deep breath. "I went to Denver to settle some business matters. I've been considering expanding my ranch, buying more cattle. The bank in Wyatt couldn't provide the loan I needed, so I went to Denver." "I see," Daisy said, not entirely understanding why this required a formal call. "While I was there, I did a lot of thinking. About the future. About what I want." He met her eyes directly. "Your letters helped with that thinking." Daisy felt her cheeks warm. "Did they?" Griffin nodded. "Been on my own a long time. Convinced myself that's how I preferred it, but building your cabin, seeing this town come together to help you, made me realize some things." "What things?" Daisy asked softly. "That maybe there's more to life than just working and sleeping and waking up to do it all over again." He looked down at his glass. That maybe being alone isn't the same as being free. Daisy's heart beat faster at his words. Griffin, what are you saying? He looked up, meeting her gaze with an intensity that took her breath away. I'm saying that I care for you, Daisy Turner, more than I expected to, more than I thought I could care for anyone again. The confession hung in the air between them. Daisy felt a surge of emotions: surprise, joy, confusion, and a touch of fear. I know it's too soon, Griffin continued when she didn't respond. You're still grieving Thomas, and I respect that. I'm not asking for anything right now, just wanted you to know where I stand. Daisy found her voice. I care for you too, Griffin. I didn't expect it either, but these past months, working side by side with you, getting to know you through your actions more than your words, I've come to admire and respect you deeply. Relief washed over his features. That's good to hear. But you're right, it is soon, she continued carefully. I loved Thomas very much. His death left a hole in my life that I'm still learning to live with. Griffin nodded solemnly. I understand. Lost my own wife and daughter 8 years ago. Fever took them both in a week. Thought I'd never feel anything again after that. The revelation stunned her, though Martha had hinted at such a tragedy. I'm so sorry. Been a long time now, Griffin said, though the pain was still evident in his eyes. Point is, I know about grief, know it takes its own time. I'm not looking to rush you, Daisy. Just wanted to be honest about my feelings before they became any stronger. Daisy reached across the table and tentatively placed her hand over his. Thank you for your honesty, and for understanding. Griffin turned his hand to clasp hers, his calloused fingers warm and strong. So where does this leave us, friends? Daisy said firmly. Good friends, getting to know each other better, and then we'll see what happens. A small smile tugged at his lips. I can accept those terms, good. Daisy smiled back, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. Now, would you like to see the garden? Your seeds have done remarkably well. The summer months passed in a pleasant rhythm. Daisy settled fully into her new home, tending her garden, occasionally helping neighbors with various tasks, and slowly rebuilding her life. Griffin called regularly, sometimes bringing small gifts, a book he thought she might enjoy, fresh game from a hunting trip, a jar of honey from a wild hive his ranch hands had discovered. They kept their relationship circumspect, mindful of the town's potential for gossip, but their growing attachment was difficult to hide. They often walked together on Sunday afternoons after church, or sat on Daisy's porch in the evenings, talking quietly as the sun set behind the mountains. Griffin spoke haltingly at first, unused to sharing his thoughts, but gradually opened up about his past, his hopes for his ranch, his memories of his wife and daughter. Daisy, in turn, told him about her childhood in St. Louis, her whirlwind courtship with Thomas, and their early struggles homesteading in Colorado. She found it easier to speak of Thomas as time passed, remembering the joy of their years together rather than just the pain of his loss. By August, when the garden was yielding its bounty and Daisy was busy preserving vegetables for winter, she realized that her feelings for Griffin had deepened considerably. What had begun as gratitude and friendship had blossomed into something more profound. Still, she hesitated to define it, uncertain whether what she felt was truly love or simply the natural attachment that might grow between two lonely people. One warm evening, as they sat on her porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, Griffin broke a comfortable silence. Been thinking about expanding the cabin before winter. Daisy looked at him in surprise. This cabin, he nodded. It's well built but small, thought you might appreciate another room, proper bedroom, maybe a larger kitchen. That's very thoughtful, but it's not necessary, Daisy protested. It's more than adequate for just me. Griffin's eyes held her steadily. Might not always be just you. The implication hung in the air between them. Daisy's heart quickened. Griffin. Not proposing, he said quickly. Not yet, just planning ahead. Planning ahead for what exactly? Daisy pressed, needing clarity. Griffin sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort with expressing emotions. For us, he finally said. If that's what you want too. Daisy felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with lingering uncertainty. I think I might want that, she admitted softly, but I need a little more time to be sure. Griffin nodded, replacing his hat. Time you shall have, but the offer stands for the cabin expansion and the rest. Daisy smiled, touched by his patience and understanding. Thank you. Before he left that night, Griffin did something he had never done before. He leaned down and gently kissed her cheek, his lips barely brushing her skin. The gesture was brief but significant, a promise of possibilities to come. September brought cooler temperatures and the beginning of the aspen tree's golden transformation. Daisy's garden was winding down, though she still harvested late tomatoes and squash. Her pantry shelves were lined with preserves and canned vegetables, a visible testament to her industry and resilience. Griffin continued his regular visits, and they fell into an easy companionship that felt increasingly natural. One crisp Sunday after church, he invited her to visit his ranch for the first time. Thought you might like to see it, he said as they walked back toward her cabin. Been talking about it enough, figure you might be curious. Daisy smiled. I'd like that very much. They arranged for Griffin to pick her up the following Saturday morning. When the day arrived, Daisy dressed with particular care in a forest green dress that Martha had once commented brought out the auburn highlights in her hair. She packed a basket with bread she had baked and preserves from her garden, anticipating they might have lunch at the ranch. Griffin arrived promptly, driving a wagon rather than riding his usual horse. He helped Daisy up to the seat with a gentle hand, and they set off, the autumn morning sparkling around them. Nervous? Griffin asked, noting her unusual quietness as they traveled. A little, Daisy admitted. It feels significant, seeing where you live. Griffin nodded, understanding. It's not fancy, just so you know. I wouldn't expect it to be, she replied with a smile. After about an hour's drive, they crested a ridge and Griffin drew the horses to a halt. Below them stretched a picturesque valley bisected by a small river. A neat cluster of buildings, a main house, a barn, and several outbuildings stood near the river, while cattle grazed on the surrounding grasslands. The backdrop of mountains, their peaks already dusted with early snow, completed the stunning vista. It's beautiful, Daisy breathed. Griffin's expression softened with pride. This is the view I was telling you about, the one that made me feel like I'd found home. I can see why. She turned to him, touched by the significance of him sharing this moment. Thank you for bringing me here. They continued down into the valley, and as they approached the ranch proper, two men emerged from the barn to greet them. These are my hands, Griffin explained. Luke Donovan and Miguel Ramirez, been with me almost since I started. The men tipped their hats respectfully to Daisy as Griffin made introductions. She noted the easy camaraderie between the three men, another side of Griffin she hadn't fully seen before. Thought I'd show Mrs. Turner around the place, Griffin told them. Everything under control. Yes, boss, Luke replied. Moved the north herd to the lower pasture like you asked. Miguel fixed that leak in the barn roof. Good men, Griffin said with approval. We'll be back in a bit. He helped Daisy down from the wagon and led her first to the main house, a solid, single-story structure built of logs and stone. Inside, it was simply but comfortably furnished, with a large stone fireplace reminiscent of the one in Daisy's cabin. She noted with interest the small personal touches books stacked on a side table, a hand-carved chess set displayed on a shelf, a colorful quilt draped over a chair. Did you make the chess pieces? She asked, examining the intricate work. Griffin nodded. Winter evenings get long. Carving helps pass the time. They're beautiful, Daisy said sincerely. You have a gift. They continued the tour, visiting the barn with its orderly stalls and tack room, the smokehouse where game and beef were preserved for winter, and the garden where Griffin grew a modest selection of vegetables. Not as impressive as yours, he commented as they walked between the rows. Never had much luck with growing things. It's not bad, Daisy encouraged, though the soil could use some amendment. Perhaps next spring I could help you improve it. The casual reference to future seasons spent together wasn't lost on either of them. Griffin's eyes held hers for a moment before he nodded. I'd like that. They had lunch on the porch, enjoying the bread and preserves Daisy had brought along with coffee Griffin prepared. As they ate, Griffin pointed out various features of the ranch and shared his plans for expansion. That rise to the east, thinking of building there eventually. Better view, more protected from winter winds. Building what? Daisy asked. Griffin hesitated. A proper house, something bigger than this, room to grow. The implication was clear, and Daisy felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the autumn sunshine. It would be a lovely spot for a home, she agreed softly. As afternoon waned and they prepared to return to town, Daisy felt she had gained a much deeper understanding of Griffin Cole. Seeing him in his element, on the land he had shaped with his own hands, revealed aspects of his character that complemented what she already knew. His quiet competence, his thoughtful planning, his pride in his work, all were more evident here than they had been in town. On the journey back, they talked more freely than ever before, the day's experiences having broken down some invisible barrier between them. When they arrived at her cabin as twilight was falling, Griffin helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist. "Thank you for today," Daisy said, looking up at him. "I enjoyed seeing your home." "Glad you came," Griffin replied, his voice low. "Been wanting to show you for some time." They stood close together in the gathering darkness, neither making a move to step away. Finally, Griffin spoke again, his voice tentative. "Daisy, I've been patient. Tried to give you the time you needed, but I need to know, are your feelings for me changing? Or am I hoping for something that won't happen?" The directness of the question demanded equal honesty in response. Daisy took a deep breath, searching her heart. "My feelings have definitely changed," she said slowly. "When we first met, I was lost in grief, and you were a kindness I desperately needed. Now," she met his gaze steadily, "now I see you, Griffin Cole. Not just as the man who helped me rebuild, but as the man you are, and I've grown to care for that man very deeply." Relief and joy transformed his usually stoic features, deeply enough to consider a future together. "Yes," Daisy said, surprising herself with the certainty she felt. "I think it is." Griffin's hands tightened at her waist, drawing her closer. "May I kiss you, Daisy Turner?" In answer, she raised her face to his. His lips met hers gently at first, then with increasing urgency as she responded. It was a kiss of discovery and promise, tender yet passionate. When they finally parted, both were breathing quickly. "I've wanted to do that for months," Griffin admitted, his voice rough. "Why didn't you?" Daisy asked, her hands resting on his chest. "Respect for your grief, for Thomas's memory." He stroked her cheek with a callous thumb. "Wanted to be sure you were ready." The consideration touched her deeply. "Thank you for that, for understanding without my having to explain." Griffin kissed her once more, briefly but sweetly. "I should go, it's getting late. Will you come for supper tomorrow?" Daisy asked, reluctant to see him leave. He nodded. "Try and stop me." She watched him drive away, her lips still tingling from his kisses, her heart lighter than it had been in many months. For the first time since Thomas's death, Daisy allowed herself to imagine a new future, one with Griffin Cole at its center. The weeks that followed were the happiest Daisy had known since before Thomas's accident. Griffin began spending most evenings at her cabin, sometimes helping with small repairs or improvements, other times simply enjoying her company. They talked for hours, played cards, read to each other from Griffin's small collection of books, and gradually learned the rhythms and preferences of each other's lives. Their relationship blossomed under the town's approving eye. Far from finding it scandalous that the widow Turner was courting again, the people of Wyatt seemed genuinely pleased to see their happiness. Martha Miller was particularly supportive, frequently inviting them both to supper and making thinly veiled comments about the joys of marriage. As October progressed, and the aspens turned fully golden against the evergreen backdrop of pines, Griffin approached Daisy with a proposal not of marriage, but of a project. "Been thinking about that cabin expansion," he said one evening as they sat by her fire. "If we're going to do it before winter, we should start soon." Daisy looked up from her mending. "You were serious about that?" "Course I was." Griffin reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper which he opened to reveal detailed plans. "Drew this up. Addition here on the east side, proper bedroom, small sitting room. Could even add a second bedroom if you wanted." Daisy studied the plans, impressed by the thoughtfulness of the design. "It's lovely, Griffin, but it's a lot of work and winter will be here before we know it." Got Luke and Miguel willing to help, and I reckon some of the townfolk would pitch in again. He met her eyes. What do you say? Something in his expression made her suspect there was more to this proposal than just adding rooms to her cabin. Why is this so important to you? Griffin was silent for a moment, then set the plans aside and took her hands in his. Because I want to marry you, Daisy Turner. Not this minute, but soon. And I want us to have a home that's truly ours, not just your cabin that I helped build, not just my ranch house where you'd be a visitor. Something we create together for our future. Daisy's heart swelled at the sentiment behind his words. You're thinking very far ahead. Man my age has to, Griffin replied with a small smile, not getting any younger. She squeezed his hands. You're not exactly ancient at 38. Old enough to know what I want. His expression grew serious. And I want you, Daisy, want a life with you. Whether that's here or at the ranch or somewhere else entirely doesn't much matter to me, but I'd like to build something together literally and figuratively. The sincerity in his voice moved her deeply. Then let's do it, she said softly. Let's expand the cabin. Griffin's face lit with pleasure. You mean it? I do. Daisy leaned forward and kissed him gently. And when it's finished, we can discuss that other proposal you're hinting at. Work on the cabin expansion began immediately. As Griffin had predicted, many of the townspeople volunteered to help, grateful for the opportunity to repay Daisy and Griffin for their assistance during the Simmons fire. Luke and Miguel came from the ranch several days a week, and progress was swift despite the increasingly cold weather. Daisy worked alongside everyone, as she had during the original construction, but this time with a different spirit. Where before she had been rebuilding out of necessity, now she was creating something new with hope and anticipation. Each beam raised, each wall framed, represented another step toward a future with Griffin. As the expansion took shape, they made decisions together where windows should be placed to catch the morning light, how large to make the new bedroom, what type of wood to use for the floors. These conversations often led to deeper ones about their preferences and expectations for married life. Would you want to live here or at the ranch? Daisy asked one evening as they reviewed the progress. Griffin considered the question. Honestly, both if we could manage it. Ranch needs daily attention, but town has its advantages. Maybe we could split our time, summers at the ranch, winters here. Or whatever suits us. The flexibility of his thinking pleased her. That sounds perfect. By mid-November, the basic structure was complete, and they focused on the interior work that could continue despite the increasingly frequent snowfalls. Griffin installed the windows he'd specially ordered from Denver, while Daisy sewed curtains and planned the arrangement of furniture. One snowy afternoon, as they worked together installing shelves in what would become their bedroom, Griffin paused, hammer in hand. Been meaning to ask you something, he said, uncharacteristically hesitant. What is it? Daisy asked, holding a shelf in place. Would you want children? Of your own, I mean. The question clearly cost him effort to ask. Know you're fond of the Simmons kids and the others in town, but never discussed if you wanted to be a mother. Daisy carefully considered her answer, knowing how significant the question was. Griffin had lost his only child years ago. The thought of becoming a father again must carry both hope and fear for him. Thomas and I tried, she said softly, for years. Nothing happened. Doctor in Denver said I might not be able to have children. She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. Would that be a disappointment to you? Griffin set down the hammer and took her hands in his. No, he said firmly. I asked because I wanted to know your wishes, not because it would change how I feel about you. I had my daughter. Was blessed with her for 4 short years. If we had children together, I'd be grateful. If we didn't, I'd still count myself the luckiest man in Colorado to have you as my wife. Tears pricked at Daisy's eyes. Thank you for that. Griffin kissed her gently, then picked up the hammer again. Still haven't answered my question, though. Daisy smiled through her tears. Yes, I would want children with you, very much. And if nature doesn't oblige us, there are always children who need homes. The thought had clearly never occurred to Griffin. You'd consider taking in someone else's child, of course. Love makes a family, not just blood. She touched his face gently. I'd be proud to raise a child with you, Griffin Cole, however that child came to us. The tenderness in his expression as he returned to his work told her all she needed to know about his feelings on the matter. By early December, the cabin expansion was nearly complete. The new bedroom was finished, warm and cozy with a small fireplace of its own. The sitting room still needed some finishing touches, but it was already a pleasant space with bookshelves Griffin had built and comfortable chairs they'd purchased together from the general store. As a surprise for Daisy, Griffin had added one feature not in the original plans, a bay window in the sitting room that looked out toward the mountains. When he showed it to her, explaining that he'd wanted her to have a special place to sit and watch the changing light on the peaks she loved so much, she'd been too moved to speak, communicating her gratitude with kisses instead. With Christmas approaching, they made plans to officially complete the project before the holiday. Griffin spent more nights in town than at his ranch, staying at the hotel to maintain propriety while being close enough to work on the cabin daily. They had not yet announced their intention to marry, but the town had clearly drawn its own conclusions from their obvious attachment and the significant expansion to Daisy's home. One evening in mid-December, as a heavy snow fell outside, they sat together by the fire in Daisy's original cabin room, discussing the final details of the expansion. "Just need to finish the trim in the sitting room and install the last window," Griffin said, reviewing his mental checklist. "Should be done by week's end, weather permitting." Daisy nodded, her expression thoughtful, and then Griffin looked at her questioningly. "And then it's finished, ready for whatever comes next." "Which is?" Daisy pressed gently, understanding dawned in his eyes. Setting aside the cup of coffee he'd been nursing, Griffin moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "Daisy Turner," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his face, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Though she had been expecting the question, Daisy found herself momentarily speechless. This man, who had entered her life at its darkest point, had brought light and hope back into her world. She loved him deeply, completely, in a way that honored rather than diminished what she had shared with Thomas. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Griffin, I will marry you." Joy transformed his face as he rose to kiss her. The kiss deepened, expressing all the love and desire that had been building between them over the months of their courtship. When they finally parted, both were breathing heavily. "When?" Griffin asked, his forehead resting against hers. "Soon," Daisy replied, her hands still twined around his neck. "I don't want to wait long. Christmas," he suggested, "would give us time to make arrangements, tell people proper." Daisy considered the idea. "Christmas Eve," she decided, "a new beginning as the year ends." Griffin smiled. Christmas Eve it is. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Wyatt, met with universal approval and good wishes. Martha Miller immediately appointed herself unofficial wedding coordinator, offering advice on everything from Daisy's dress to the reception that would follow the ceremony. "Nothing elaborate," Daisy insisted when Martha suggested ordering special decorations from Denver. "Just a simple ceremony with our friends, followed by a meal together. That's all we want." Despite Daisy's wishes for simplicity, the women of the town were determined to make the occasion special. They banded together to help finish the cabin expansion, sewing curtains and cushions, polishing floors, and arranging furniture. The men, not to be outdone, completed the exterior work despite the snow, ensuring that the entire structure was weathertight and secure. Griffin, for his part, threw himself into completing his own surprise for Daisy, furnishing the new bedroom with a beautiful bed frame he had crafted himself. The headboard carved with an intricate pattern of intertwined columbines similar to those on the wooden box he'd given her months before. As Christmas Eve approached, preparations intensified. Daisy, with Martha's help, altered her best dress, a rich burgundy wool that complemented her auburn hair, adding lace at the collar and cuffs for a more festive appearance. Griffin ordered a new suit from Denver, which arrived just 3 days before the wedding, much to his relief. The day before the ceremony, Griffin visited Daisy at the cabin, bringing with him a small leather pouch. "Wedding gift," he explained, handing it to her. "Traditionally given after the ceremony, but thought you might want this for tomorrow." Daisy opened the pouch to find a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "Griffin, it's beautiful," she breathed. "Belonged to my mother," he said quietly. "Only thing of hers I still have. Would be honored if you'd wear it." Touched beyond words, Daisy slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit as if made for her. "I'll treasure it always," she promised. Griffin smiled, clearly pleased by her reaction. "One more day," he said, kissing her gently. "Then you're stuck with me for good." "I can't wait," Daisy replied sincerely. Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold, the fresh snow sparkling under a bright winter sun. The church had been decorated with evergreen boughs and candles for the holiday, creating a festive atmosphere for the wedding that would take place that afternoon. Martha and several other women arrived at Daisy's cabin early to help her prepare. As they arranged her hair and helped her dress, Daisy found herself thinking of her journey over the past year, from devastating loss to unexpected joy, from the ashes of her old life to the promise of a new one. "Penny for your thoughts," Martha said, noticing her pensive expression. "Just reflecting," Daisy replied. "A year ago, I never could have imagined being here, about to marry again. Life takes such unexpected turns." Martha nodded, understanding that it does, but if anyone deserves happiness, it's you, Daisy Turner. Soon to be Daisy Cole, she added with a smile. At the appointed hour, Sheriff Miller arrived to escort Daisy to the church, a role he had requested in the absence of her father. As they walked through the snowy streets, townspeople called out good wishes and congratulations. The church was filled to capacity when they arrived. It seemed everyone in Wyatt had turned out for the occasion. As Daisy paused in the doorway, her eyes sought and found Griffin, standing tall and straight at the altar, looking more handsome than she had ever seen him in his new suit. When their eyes met across the crowded church, everything and everyone else seemed to fade away. This man, who had once been a stranger, was now the center of her world. As she walked toward him, Daisy felt absolutely certain that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The ceremony was simple but deeply moving. They exchanged traditional vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other for as long as they both lived. When Griffin placed his mother's ring on Daisy's finger for all to see, his hands were steady but his eyes glistened with emotion. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss the bride." Griffin cupped Daisy's face gently in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. The church erupted in applause and cheers as they turned to face their friends as Mr. and Mrs. Cole. The celebration that followed at the town hall was joyous and warm. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in Wyatt. Music from a hastily assembled band of local talent filled the air, and dancing continued well into the evening. Griffin, normally reserved in public, surprised everyone by leading Daisy in dance after dance, clearly unable to bear being separated from his new wife. As the festivities wound down, they said their goodbyes and walked hand in hand through the snowy streets toward their home, no longer just Daisy's cabin, but their shared beginning. Griffin surprised her by sweeping her into his arms as they reached the porch. "Tradition," he explained with a rare grin as he carried her across the threshold. Inside, the cabin was warm and welcoming, with a fire burning in the hearth and candles casting a soft glow over their newly completed home. Daisy looked around with satisfaction and joy, seeing in every beam and board the promise of their future together. "Welcome home, Mrs. Cole," Griffin said softly, setting her on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "Home," Daisy repeated, leaning into his embrace. "Our home." As snow began to fall again outside, they moved together toward the bedroom where the beautiful bed Griffin had crafted awaited them. No more words were needed as they began their life together, a life neither had expected to find, built from the ashes of loss into something new, strong, and enduring. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Griffin and Daisy divided their time between the cabin in town and the ranch, gradually expanding both properties as their needs evolved. Griffin's cattle business prospered, allowing them a comfortable living, while Daisy established herself as a skilled gardener and preserver whose products became sought after throughout the county. Their greatest joy came 2 years after their marriage when, against all expectations, Daisy discovered she was expecting a child. The pregnancy was difficult, requiring extended bed rest during the final months, but Griffin's devoted care saw her through. In the spring of 1882, they welcomed a healthy daughter whom they named Grace, in recognition of the unexpected blessing she represented in their lives. Grace was followed 3 years later by a son, Thomas Griffin, named for the two men who had shaped Daisy's life in profound ways. The family was complete, their happiness full. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Griffin surprised Daisy by taking her to the spot where her original home had burned. There, amid the wildflowers that now grew where destruction had once reigned, he presented her with a small carved wooden heart. "5 years ago," he said, placing it in her palm, "you lost everything to fire. But from those ashes we built something stronger, something that will endure." Daisy closed her fingers around the carved heart, tears of happiness in her eyes. "I never thought I could be this happy again," she admitted. "You gave me back my future, Griffin Cole." He shook his head, drawing her close. "We built it together, just like I promised that first day." As they stood together on the land where their journey had begun, surrounded by the beauty of the Colorado wilderness and secure in the love they had forged through hardship and joy, Daisy knew that some endings were really just beginnings in disguise. From the ashes of her greatest loss had risen her greatest happiness, a home, a family, and a love that would last a lifetime.